Welcome back to Love and Hard Money. I'm Brian, and this is episode 4. Last episode, I went off script and talked about Epstein and how we can use Bitcoin to take some of the power back from a corrupt elite. This episode, I want to break down some of the mechanisms they use to enforce that power. Right up front, I'll say almost everything you've been told about inflation is wrong. Not just incomplete, not just misleading, wrong. This is especially true if you've studied economics in school. So, now that I've alienated most of the economists, let's jump in. Once you see what inflation actually is, a lot of things that haven't made sense suddenly click into place. Why your paycheck feels like it's buying less every year, even though the government says inflation is only 3%. Why your parents could buy a house on a single income, but you can't on 2. Why becoming a millionaire used to mean something, and now it just means you can afford a down payment. The Austrian economist Ludwig von Mises said, "The most important thing to remember is that inflation is not an act of God, that inflation is not a catastrophe of the elements, or a disease that comes like the plague. Inflation is a policy." At the risk of giving away the ending right at the start, here's my simple assessment. People close to the money spigot want you to believe inflation is simply a change in prices, but inflation is actually a change in the amount of money in the system. I'm going to say that again. Inflation is not prices going up. Inflation is the supply of money going up. More money chasing the same amount of things leads to persistent, across-the-board inflation. This seems like a subtle distinction at first glance, but it's one of the most insidious lies ever told. The reason is that changes in prices can be blamed on all sorts of things. OPEC cut oil production, a hurricane hit the Gulf, political tensions in Indonesia raised the price of palm oil, and the always popular greedy corporations are price gouging. In every case, someone else is blamed, and price changes are often used as an excuse for political interventions that further concentrate power with the small group who has a monopoly on the ability to create money. The very people who create the phenomenon we all feel as inflation are the same people who publish the CPI, or Consumer Price Index, that we are told measures inflation. And since hungry people who can't afford housing are politically destabilizing, they have every incentive to paint the world in a positive light. CPI shows inflation at 2 to 3% per year, but the money supply is growing by closer to 10% since 2020. So, if you're working a W-2 job and getting a cost of living adjustment every year of 3%, you're falling further and further behind. We all feel it, but we're told not to believe our lying eyes. The party told you to reject the evidence of your eyes and ears. It was their final, most essential command. George Orwell, 1984. Prices change for all sorts of reasons, and in a closed system without more money being added, high prices are the cure for high prices. Say there was an earthquake in California, and the oil refineries couldn't deliver gasoline to the southern half of the state. Prices of gas would skyrocket. That would send signals to the market. Don't drive unless you have an urgent need. And if you have gas available in Northern California, ship it to Southern California as fast as you can to take advantage of the high prices. As the market participants respond to price signals, the supply will normalize and the crisis will resolve faster. If, on the other hand, a policy is passed that says gas stations can't raise prices during the emergency, then consumers won't prioritize thrift and suppliers in other regions won't have incentive to truck the product further to help alleviate the shortage. That will exacerbate the problem. In a free market, price signals are always self-correcting. Those swings in prices are not the same thing as persistent economy-wide inflation. When prices go up all across the economy, it doesn't mean that goods got bigger or better. There's just more money chasing the same amount of goods. Again, inflation isn't prices rising. Inflation is the money supply increasing. Rising prices are just the symptom. This isn't some new insight. Austrian economists have been saying this for over a century. Murray Rothbard put it simply: inflation is not a rise in prices. It is an increase in the supply of money. Ludwig von Mises, again, writing in 1912, defined it this way: inflation is an increase in the quantity of money without a corresponding increase in the demand for money. So, if inflation is an increase in money, why does everyone think inflation means prices going up? Because that's what we've been conditioned to believe, and there's a reason for that conditioning, which we'll get to. Let's look more closely at the CPI. The official measure of inflation in the United States is the Consumer Price Index, or CPI. The Bureau of Labor Statistics tracks the prices of a basket of goods and services that supposedly represents what average Americans buy. When that basket costs more, they say inflation went up. But here's the problem. That basket keeps changing. They swap out items. They make quality adjustments, where if a product gets better, they say the price didn't really go up. You just got more value. They use something called hedonic regression, a fancy accounting trick that basically allows them to say, your iPhone is so much better than last year's model that even though it costs more, it's actually cheaper when you account for all the improvements. Let me give you two examples that cut through all that statistical manipulation. Housing. In 1994, the median home price in the U.S. was around $130,000. Today, it's over $400,000. That's a 3x increase. But according to CPI, inflation has only been about 2 to 3% per year on average. If you actually applied 2.5% annual inflation to that 1994 house price, it would cost about $240,000 today, not $400,000. College tuition. In 1994, the average cost of a 4-year degree at a public university was about $10,000 for tuition and fees. Today, over $40,000, a 4x increase. Again, way higher than official CPI would predict. So, either CPI is accurate and housing and education just happen to be outliers, or CPI is designed to understate actual inflation. I'll let you decide which seems more likely. This hits home for me personally. I'm a millennial. When I was a kid in the 90s, being a millionaire meant something extraordinary. There was this Disney movie called Blank Check, where a 12-year-old kid accidentally gets $1 million. And what does he do? He buys a mansion for $300,000. He adds a water slide, a go-kart track. He got a personal butler, Mr. Macintosh, driving him around in a limo. That was the fantasy. $1 million meant you could buy everything a kid could dream of and still have money left over. Fast forward 30 years. In Seattle, in Denver, in Austin, in most of coastal California, $1 million gets you a standard 3-bedroom house in a decent neighborhood, not a mansion with a water slide, not a castle bedroom, not Mr. Macintosh, a normal house that a middle-class family lives in. The word millionaire hasn't changed. The dollar has. And you've felt this. You know something is wrong. When your grandparents tell stories about buying their first house for $30,000, you do the mental math with the government's inflation numbers, and it still doesn't add up to what that same house costs today. You're not crazy. Your instincts are right. Let me show you the proof. The stock market is supposed to be where you build wealth, right? You invest in the S&P 500, the market goes up 10% per year on average, and you retire rich. But here's something they don't show you. If you measure the S&P 500 in gold instead of dollars, it's basically flat since 1995. The same. No real gains. What does that mean? It means the stock market didn't make you richer. The dollar got weaker and stocks repriced accordingly. Think about it this way. From 1995 to today, the M2 money supply, that's basically all the dollars in circulation, has grown at about 6 to 7% per year on average, and it's accelerated to closer to 10% since 2020. The S&P has returned about 10% nominally. The government says inflation is 2 to 3%, so you made 7 to 8% real returns, right? But gold says no. Gold says you made 0. You stayed even. So who's lying? The CPI or the 5,000-year track record of gold as a store of value? I know which one I trust. Now let me share something even more striking. This podcast is audio only, so I can't put the chart up for you, but try to picture this in your mind as we go through it. In 2016, a median-priced home cost about 664 Bitcoin. That house was selling for around $288,000. With me so far? In 2020, that same house cost just 45 Bitcoin. The dollar price, though, had gone up to 329,000. So we're watching prices in dollars go up while they fall in Bitcoin. By 2024, that same house cost 6.6 Bitcoin. The dollar price was 434,000. So in dollars, housing got 50% more expensive in 8 years. In Bitcoin, it got 99% cheaper. What's happening here? Is the house changing? Yes, it's getting more valuable relative to everything else because it can't be inflated. This is what happens when you measure things in hard money instead of soft money. You start to see the truth. The house isn't getting more valuable. The dollar is getting less valuable. Bitcoin is holding value, and the difference is stark. Now, this is a sidebar, but it's important to understand Bitcoin is young and the world is still figuring out how to value it. Price discovery is a volatile process and nothing goes up in a straight line. But if you measure in years instead of weeks, the trend is clear. If you're thinking about allocating to Bitcoin, it's important to understand why and how it fits into your risk tolerance profile. It's also important to understand it's a bearer asset, which means the magic happens when you learn to hold it yourself, not with a custodian. I learned on my own and made a lot of mistakes, but there are now professionals who specialize in helping people think about allocation and custody strategies, and you might want to consider working with one. This isn't an ad. You can find them on your own, and I strongly suggest that you do to avoid the mistakes a lot of us made early on in our Bitcoin journey. So, if inflation is so destructive, why do governments do it? Why not just keep the money supply stable? Because they can't afford to. Here's the trap they're in. The U.S. government is approaching $39 trillion in debt. That debt has interest payments. As of 2024, we're paying over $1 trillion a year just in interest. That doesn't pay down the principal, just interest. Where does that money come from? Tax revenue and borrowing more money. But here's the key. That debt is denominated in dollars. If you owe $39 trillion and you print more dollars to service that debt, what happens to the real value of your debt? It goes down. This is why inflation is politically convenient. It's a hidden tax. When they print money, it slowly devalues every dollar you've saved. You feel poorer, but it's hard to see exactly who took your wealth. Meanwhile, the government's debt burden gets lighter in real terms. And it's not just the debt, it's the promises. Social Security, Medicare, government pensions, these are all denominated in dollars, and they're all underfunded to the tune of $200 plus trillion in the United States. That's above and beyond the debt. The only way to pay for these commitments without explicit tax increases or benefit cuts is to inflate the currency and pay people back in cheaper dollars. President Nayib Bukele of El Salvador put it perfectly at CPAC. If you can print money, why do you charge taxes? And if you need to charge taxes, why do you print money? It's the worst of both worlds. They tell you that you need to pay for services of the government through taxes, but they keep printing money, which makes all the money that you have worth less. He's right. If they can just print what they need, why take your money? And if they're taking your money, why are they printing more? The answer is they want both. They want the appearance of fiscal responsibility through taxation, and they want the hidden tax of inflation through money printing. The people who benefit from this are the ones closest to the money printer: big banks, Wall Street, government contractors, politically connected industries. This is called the Cantillon Effect, named after Richard Cantillon, who described it in the 1700s. New money doesn't enter the economy evenly. It goes to certain people first, and they get to spend it before prices rise. By the time that money reaches you, through your salary, it's already lost purchasing power. You're not paranoid. The game is rigged, and inflation is how they rig it. So what do you do about it? How do you protect yourself from inflation if inflation is an increase in the money supply? You save in something that can't be inflated. For most of human history, that was gold. Gold is hard money. It's scarce. It's durable. People recognize it as valuable across cultures and centuries. Gold has protected wealth through empires rising and falling, through currencies being debased, through wars and revolution. And even today, gold works. If you'd saved in gold instead of dollars over the last 50 years, you'd have preserved your purchasing power. The S&P measured in gold is flat. Housing measured in gold is relatively stable. Gold does the job. But gold has fatal flaws. It's heavy. It's not divisible in practical ways for everyday transactions. It's hard to verify purity without specialized equipment. And because of these limitations, gold tends to centralize. That is why we're not on a gold standard today, because gold failed to protect people from central banks and profligate governments. Throughout history, people stored their gold with banks and governments because it was easier than carrying it around. And then what happened? The banks issued more receipts than they had gold. Governments confiscated it, like the U.S. did in 1933 with Executive Order 6102, issued by Franklin Delano Roosevelt. That order made it illegal to own gold and forced everyone to turn it in for paper dollars at a fixed price. And then, immediately, they devalued those dollars against gold. Gold's physical properties make it vulnerable to centralization, and centralization makes it vulnerable to control. This is where Bitcoin changes everything. Bitcoin is the first form of money that's been engineered from the ground up to be hard money, that can also function as money in everyday exchange. It's scarce. Only 21 million will ever exist. It's divisible. You can send a fraction of a cent. It's portable. You can move $1 billion across borders in minutes with a phone. It's verifiable. The entire history of every transaction is on a public ledger that anyone can check. And most importantly, it's decentralized. No government, no bank, no company controls it. Gold is analog hard money. It does an excellent job of preserving value, but it doesn't meet all the requirements of modern money. Bitcoin is digital hard money that does. This is why measuring things in Bitcoin shows you the truth about inflation. Bitcoin can't be inflated. The supply is fixed by code. So when you price things in Bitcoin, you're measuring them with a stable ruler. And what you see is that the house isn't getting more expensive. Your labor isn't getting less valuable. The dollar is getting weaker. Inflation is an increase in money supply. The only way to protect yourself from that is to save in something that can't be inflated. For thousands of years, that was gold. Today, we have something better. You aren't crazy when you feel like you're falling behind. You are right. The system is designed to transfer your wealth upward, slowly, and visibly. Bitcoin gives you a way out. That's it for episode 3. Next week, we're going to get more personal. I'm going to talk about my book for kids called The Winds of Uncertainty. It's a hero's journey with a lot of parallels to my own life that I think a lot of millennials will resonate with. It's about the costs of inflation and the value of hard work, honesty, and hard money. The book is currently only available for Bitcoin through my website, satoshigeneral.com. Thanks for listening.